Hello everyone, welcome to Lecture 10, Agriculture and Multi-Ethnic Organizing. In the pictures on this front slide, we have Larry Itliong, Philip Veracruz is the second picture, Dolores Huerta, and Cesar Chavez. The reason I chose to put these pictures on this front slide is because they represent the historic leadership, if you will, of the United Farm Workers. But oftentimes, when we talk about the United Farm Workers, the only person who is recognized as part of the struggle is really Cesar Chavez. And it's not that he wasn't a charismatic leader, and it wasn't that he didn't actually move a social movement union forward. In fact, he was very significant in that. But I think that the construction of the United Farm Workers as solely a Mexican union has served a very particular purpose, which is to isolate the ways in which work really happens in the fields of California. We forget that farm work, even in today's day and age, also includes female workers. We also know that the history of the United Farm Workers would not have come into being had it not been for the work of the Filipino farm workers as well. And that when they came to power, when they were able to be when they were successful in their campaigns, was when they were finally able to bring these very diverse groups together. And so what this particular lecture looks at is the importance of diversity in labor unions and why it matters. I think one of the most interesting stories I ever heard came from Dolores Huerta herself, where she talks about the background behind this, the UFW kind of rallying call, Si Se Puede, which for those of you guys who are familiar with so much of labor organizing today, oftentimes it's a very call and response. The person will say Se Puede, and people will say Si Se Puede, which is a very important yes we can, right? So many people assume that that quote came from Cesar Chavez, when in fact it was actually Dolores Huerta as an organizer who, on a visit to one of the camps where the migrant farm workers, was talking to the farm workers about what needed to be done in order to make change happen, in order to successfully win higher wages. And she talks about talking to these men for over an hour. And at the end of her talk, she says, "Se puede," and they said, "Si se puede," and that was the original start of the Si se puede story. But we don't give credit to Dolores Huerta for that story. And I think it's very significant about who gets erased. Well, Dolores Huerta is someone who, even now, probably is a little bit more popular than the two Filipino organizers. What does it mean when we only think about Cesar Chavez as it relates to the United Farm Workers? And that's a question that you should think about. It's also the reason why the readings for this week focus on presenting you with two other perspectives on leadership, on the unions, to provide differing opinions and differing perspectives on the United Farm Workers. And I think it's important to note that everybody who lives history remembers it differently. We see this in our families. We understand this even with our own, among our own friends. When something happens and you ask three people to tell you what happened, you'll get three different stories. And so the truth in all of this is usually somewhere in between. And part of what my goal is to really start having you hear some of the differing narratives on the United Farm Workers history. Part of what I want to do in this lecture is to look at the history of the United Farm Workers as a multi-ethnic organizing union. I want to talk about why multi-ethnic unions matter, and the struggle, both the obstacles and strategies and tactics used to build a multi-ethnic coalition. So why diversity matters? Well, historically, there were unions for minorities. I think that's important to note. That, as I've noted in previous lectures, unions, when they first came to fruition, were very centered around whiteness, and particularly white male workers. But over time in the United States, we did see the development of minority unions. These unions were generally monoracial. They were only open to U.S. citizens and occurred in industries where workers were shut out of white unions. So I want to give a few different examples that you could easily find on the internet, and there have been different movies made for them. One is Los Mineros in New Mexico. These were the Mexican mine workers in New Mexico, who for 30 years struggled to be recognized as a union. This union was all Mexican workers. Most of the and membership on into this union was based on proving that you were a U.S. citizen, meaning that you were born here in the United States. And these miners struggled for 3 different generations, or over 30 years, to get union recognition and to fight against 2 main things. One is wage suppression, and the second piece was worker safety. Working in the mines, there were a lot of issues around deaths in the mine and worker safety, and then, of course, wages were artificially depressed. I think what's important to note in the Los Mineros case, and it's something that if any of you guys want a citation on it, I'm happy to give it to you. The Los Mineros strike also brought in their families. The families, the mothers, the wives also walked the picket line in order to make a point to the owners of these mines. The 2 other examples I have here are probably a lot more famous because they were directly related to the civil rights movement. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union. What they did was basically, this was all African American sleeping car workers who unionized during the civil rights movement to improve their wages. And then, of course, you have the sanitation workers of Memphis, who, as most people know, was who Dr. Martin Luther King was going to support when he was assassinated in Memphis. And these workers were basically combating, number one, the number of casualties that had occurred on the job when 2 of their workers had been crushed by the machinery. And for at least 10 years, or over 10 years, these same workers have been fighting to have their union recognized, 1,300 African-American sanitation workers. And so part of what the civil rights movement was about was also supporting these workers. All of these unions were all monoracial. And they really kind of focused internally on what was happening at a particular site. I think it's also important to note that I could cite other unions, namely like those affiliated with the canneries in Alaska, as well as in Monterey. They were also monoracial for Asian workers. But again, what we see here is that it didn't really invoke sort of a organizing across different groups. And I think what we did begin to see, particularly around the time period where Marshall Gans is talking about, that we talk about as it relates to United Farm Workers, is that agriculture and cannery work represent 2 of the main industries where multi-ethnic unions first developed, where we began to see that the industry itself depended on workers not communicating with each other, and therefore, in order for unions to make gains in that industry, they actually had to start working across racial lines. I think what we begin to start looking at when we look at the United Farm Workers is that the popular history constructs the United Farm Workers as a Mexican immigrant union. I think this is false for a few different reasons. Number one, lost in this history is the history of the Japanese, Mexican, and Filipino farm workers, particularly in the Central Valley of California. There, as Marshall Gans talks about in his piece, that while Mexicans were disproportionate to the larger group, Filipino and the Japanese farm workers were also part of the migrant labor in Delano, Fresno, Bakersfield, and all throughout the Central Valley. I think the second piece that people also forget is that they weren't necessarily a first-generation immigrant union, meaning that these immigrants had just arrived in the United States. In fact, the United Farm Workers was also one of the unions that, particularly early on in its history, only wanted citizens to be part of its rank and file. So these are a couple things that get lost, that even while the United Farm Workers stance changed in the 1990s, this is a relatively new change, and that the history of the United Farm Workers followed a very similar pattern that we saw with the Los Mineros, particularly in New Mexico, as well as the cannery workers in Alaska and in Monterey, which used citizenship as a very formal requirement to belong to that union. I think what's also important to note is that there are a number of organizing obstacles that multi-ethnic unions face. It's not easy to organize across different racial and ethnic groups. First and foremost, I think one of the things that we need to remember about the United Farm Workers is that there were parallel organizing efforts going on, meaning that you had Mexican farm workers being organized by Mexican organizers, Japanese farm workers being organized by Japanese organizers, and Filipino farm workers being organized by Filipino organizers, all into separate unions. And each of them, as is noted in Marshall Ganz's work, as well as in the a little bit in the documentary that you watched, although that was somewhat obscured, each of these groups tried to have their own strikes, but it was largely ineffective because the employers could use or employ a divide and conquer strategy, meaning that in the absence of Mexican workers, they could ask the Filipino workers to go and work the fields. In the absence of Filipino workers, they could ask the Mexicans to go work the fields. In other words, there was always another labor group that they could hire and still get the work done for the same price. The differing wage structures was also really important to note. Is that across different groups, different farmers paid different wages to different groups, and these different wage structures meant that some of the groups would not feel compelled to necessarily organize or strike for the other workers. I think that the different wage structures, while none of them were paid very well, also led to some groups being dissatisfied while others were felt that they were okay and didn't necessarily move to action. And I think maybe the biggest obstacle that organizations face, particularly when you look at trying to organize an industry like agriculture, were the language differences. Um, you had Japanese, you had different dialects of the Filipino language, which could be Tagalog or Ilocano, and then any number of other languages, as well as Spanish, that were all um, a big part of what was going on in terms of creating different structures for people to have to address. These language differences were significant because it meant that it was very hard to facilitate um, conversations across groups, and it meant that you had to have a very different style of approaching your organizing. And I think equally difficult, even though people don't think about it this way, are building commonalities. How does a union go about building commonalities? Well, one of the things I want to point out in this picture that I pulled here from one of the historic marches in Delano is that in the background behind Cesar Chavez, you'll see a number of crosses being held. One of the foremost tools that organizers started using to build commonalities, particularly between Filipino workers and Mexican workers, was faith, namely Catholicism. Catholicism played a huge role in bringing together the Filipinos and the Mexicans. Both populations were very religious, and religious in terms of the Catholic faith. It meant that they celebrated Mass together, but it provided a foundation upon which these groups could come together. So Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, in numerous different articles written on the United Farm Workers, they talk about that one of the very first ways in which they began to build bridges was by having Mass together. And despite the language differences, you would still see that Mass could bring, the act of communion could bring people together. So that they knew that they shared very similar values. Another similarity was the way in which families were developed for these groups, talking about families, what they meant, the extended family, what it meant in relationship to the United States. And they talk about not just family, but how we bring families together. So in many of the histories that were done in the United Farm Workers, they also talk about breaking bread, about eating together as one, that this was an act of family, and so you extend your family beyond just your blood relatives, but to the people you work with. There were similar struggles around immigration experiences to the United States, the expectations of what they thought they would be doing when they came to the United States, and the realities of farm work. And that leads to these last 2 points of exploitation and workplace abuses. Is one of the things that they began to develop was a way of translating to one another, translating from the different dialects in Filipino into English, English into Spanish. In some cases, they were lucky that some of the Filipino workers spoke a form of Spanish because of Spanish colonization of the Philippines. But for the most part, there was a lot of translation going on. And what they talked about in these circles was the exploitation that they felt in the fields, the low wages, long hours, back wages that were often owed to them when they weren't paid. Workplace abuses, meaning working without water under hot heat, the impact of pesticides on workers' health. These were all very big parts of what were discussed. And so what they began to do was to develop relationships of trust, so that rather than thinking of themselves as entirely different, they began to see um, themselves as being much more similar to one another. In his article, or in the chapter you read, Minority Within a Minority, I think what Vera Cruz points out are some struggles that happen in every union even to today. And one of the fundamental questions we have to ask is, do workers always have the same concerns? When you read a lot of history of labor unions, you'll find that some labor unions approach this question by saying, with a what we call a very Marxist approach. Karl Marx, in his writings, has said, "Workers of the world unite." That the idea was that their shared exploitation would absolutely lead to a worker revolution. But one of the things, in many ways, and one of the critiques of Marx would be, is that this is an oversimplistic representation of what really does happen with workers. It doesn't take into consideration all the differences that we talked about before: language, immigration, the fact that these groups are pitted against one another. So one of the things you really want to start thinking about as you're reading is, what do these workers always have the same concerns? Were the concerns of Mexicans the same as the Filipinos? And as you'll find, particularly during Vera Cruz's reading, there were some differences, and I think these are important to note. And just as importantly, as we move forward when talking about worker organizing, how do you create union goals that encompass all workers? This is a persistent question when we think about labor unions, even in the contemporary moment. This is one of the difficulties of creating a unified platform. Kind of going back to the history of the United Farm Workers, the United Farm Workers' stance against undocumented immigration created huge fractures within the United Farm Workers movement, because so many of the workers were in fact undocumented. And so the fact that they took an anti-undocumented immigrant stance, despite the fact that their worker base were also undocumented — I won't say largely undocumented, that's false — but they were undocumented as well as documented, this created huge rifts within that worker community. And so part of what we need to think about is, what does it take to build consensus? What does it take to bring groups together? I think part of what we want to begin to think about is, as a model, the United Farm Workers, for all its trials and tribulations, created a model, at least at a baseline, where we can begin to incorporate workers. The United Farm Workers acknowledged that its workforce went beyond just Mexican workers, and that in order to be successful and to develop a successful union, that they had to unify across all these different groups. This is something that Marshall Gans talks about in depth in his reading from last week. And I think when they began to acknowledge who is our workforce, their workforce being a very diverse group of people that were linguistically diverse, that were paid at different wage scales, worked on different farms, but were also pitted against each other, this provided a baseline from which they had to organize from. And so the first thing they had to do is work around the diversification of their workforce. And this meant language access and finding common ground. This is something that even to this day unions have had to do, is to acknowledge the diversification of their workforce. And this has happened in all industries, and not all industries have responded well in the modern contemporary sense. Some have chosen to just try to use the same models and ignore who the workers are demographically. And so that has led to the demise of many unions, as I'll talk about later in the semester. In particular, globalization has played a significant role in the workforce. We understand that there's been a huge, particularly since the 1980s, there has been a huge growth in the service sector. Now, the service sector, the service sector, if you're unfamiliar with that term, refers to the types of jobs that people use where they're providing services to people. So, in many ways, this includes restaurant workers, hotel workers, janitorial work. All of those types of things, right, are part of that. We also see growth in the manufacturing industries. If you go down to the garment district in LA, that's where 75% of clothes are made in the United States. This means that a very diverse workforce, stitches together the different clothes that we wear. And so in order to organize these groups, they depend on people being able to communicate across groups of workers. So the model of simultaneous translation across 2, 3, or 4 different languages is a model that's still used in place. Particularly, the SEIU has been very successful in using this for home care workers, where they have large summits where the groups talk across their different languages. They're provided with a space to start talking about their experiences. What this allows workers to do is to begin to identify the commonalities that they have with other workers who are from different ethnic and racial groups. It allows them to begin to understand what experiences that they share and what's different. And finally, I think what's significant about the model is it asks unions to conceptualize campaigns outside of the work site. Historically, particularly when you look at post-1965 till about 1995, or in that time range, unions were very focused at only organizing at a work site, meaning a particular factory or working at a particular store. That they were very focused on just organizing at that one site. But what they found is that it had its limitations, that they were relatively unsuccessful in both gaining workers but also developing meaningful relationships. And so you began to see, as part of the decline of unions, was that these workplace models weren't working for numerous different reasons. As we'll talk about later on, there were a lot of tactics used in different union campaigns to intimidate workers outside of the workplace. Some of these tactics they used were shaming tactics that were very culturally based. You're going to bring shame to your family, or in your culture, is it really okay for women to do these things? You should be grateful. These are different types of shaming tactics that were very culturally ingrained. And so part of what unions had to do is start acknowledging what matters outside of the workplace. So similar to the United Farm Workers, we understand it isn't just about what was happening in the fields. What the United Farm Workers began to do was started connecting beyond the fields to around issues around religiosity and faith. They understood Catholicism played a very important role in the lives of their workers, and so found ways in which to work with faith-based communities and with workers to celebrate their faith and talk about justice in terms of what Catholicism said, what Catholic social teaching said. They acknowledged the problems that extended beyond just the fields, meaning being able to communicate with one another. United Farm Workers also, beyond that, also realized that in order for workers to fight for one another, they needed to know each other. So developing models for working together. So it's important to think about these models and how it brings us forward and how it plays a significant role in unions today. And so these are questions I'm going to continue to come back to as we move forward in this semester.